you please take some notes during the lecture, just to write some paper. What we're going to do is introduce a number of ideas for you first. Then, once we have done this, we're going to show you some paintings. And during that particular sequence, I want you to relax and just look at the pictures, and I'll tell you what to do, because you'll have to write something down. Then we will open up the classroom to discussion. I would like you to share some of your feelings and your reactions. Then we will have a short pause. You can have a coffee, or you can fix your hair, or whatever you like to do. And then we come back and we will talk about specifically Margaret Atwood and her story, and we'll be looking at the story itself. And then finally we are going to have a summation where we are going to compare lessons that you have already had on landscape and romanticism, plus the material you have heard today on the group of 7, and finally Margaret Atwood and her specific point of view as it is shown to us in this story. So welcome. The theme today is, and this is our title page, second seminar, Margaret Atwood and what their art was like. But here's some more information that I think you will find rather interesting. The group of 7 first met in the early 20th century in 1912, and they were active as a group of painters between 1920 and 1933. Some of this material that I will be giving you today is quite available on the internet. If you look in Google under Group of 7, there are many, many articles on them. They are primarily in English. And so I've chosen what I think are some of the more interesting facts about them that relate to the lecture on landscape and on Margaret Atwood. One of the things these men wanted to do, now there were women who joined them later in the 20s, but at first it was a group of men, and they believed that they could develop a very distinctive Canadian art form. And they believed that unlike European art that they had seen in museums and in exhibitions, they wanted to go out into the wilderness of Canada and paint the landscape as they saw it. They called it a direct contact with nature. And the places they went were wilderness. They didn't paint the cities very often. They very rarely painted villages or farms. They went into the forests and the lakes, into the deep mountains, because they felt that this was perhaps the most typical image that one could paint to show how different and unique Canada was as a country. For instance, they went into the northern provinces of Ontario and Quebec, and later on in the 1920s and 30s, they took the trains, because in those days there were no airplanes. They took a 4-day journey on a train into the prairies and the Rocky Mountains, and they painted the landscapes there. Now they did this for another reason. They were very proud of being Canadians, and in particular, after many of them went as colonial soldiers into World War I, fighting for the British Empire, they came back to Canada and said, we are not British people, we are Canadians, and we live in a very special country. So some of the things that they tried to express in their painting was a feeling for their nationalism. Now, this was the very first Canadian art movement of its kind. And one of the things that these men wanted to do is that they wanted to be very modern. They didn't want to paint pictures like British painters. They didn't want to paint Victorian pictures. I don't know if you know what that term means in English, but it comes from the period of the 19th century. And these pictures were very sentimental. They were pictures of children by fireplaces, or dogs looking at their masters, or beautiful scenes of little villages in England. The Canadians said, this is not what we are like. We are more rugged. We live in the wilderness, so let's paint that. But they didn't want to do it in an old-fashioned way. They wanted to use the techniques that they had seen from the Europeans. So they had learned their lessons from a number of different schools. Most importantly, they learned from the French, because the French in the late 19th century, with the Impressionist painters, Renoir, Claude Monet, figures like this, influenced the way that they could use color and do their brushstrokes. And so the influences on them, which we are going to show you in a little while, was a modern view. They wanted to be seen as modern artists who were no longer part of a colony, even though Canada remained a colony until the 1950s. So it still was not an entirely independent country until that time. Now, one of the things you should realize is the pictures you're going to see here today are much bigger than the originals. It will be as if you were seeing pictures that are twice or 3 times the size of what you would see in a gallery. Now, there's a reason for this. When these painters went up into the wilderness, they could only carry small pieces of canvas or cardboard in their backpacks. And so the paintings that they made were no bigger than this. They're quite small. There's even a mention in the story, in the second paragraph, that Lois owns these pictures. They are not big pictures, she says, but they are valuable nevertheless. The reason they are small is that the painters had to climb through trees and go in canoes to find a place to paint their particular subjects. And so it was very difficult to carry a lot of heavy equipment. They also had to carry an axe because they would have to build fires. They would have to carry a rifle because they had to shoot game to eat it, because they were actually engaging in the wilderness. They also had to carry canvas tents, which in the 1920s were enormously heavy pieces of material. They're not like the tents we have today made of nylon. Now, many of the painters in the beginning were quite poor, so they couldn't afford to take canvas. So what they took were pieces of wood or pieces of what you call cartone, or cardboard. And they painted on these particular...
Maybe they don't know the word canvas. Canvas is the...
Those, which are paintings that are done with plaster and paint and put on the wall. The French were very great specialists in canvas painting. The Canadians became specialists in painting on wood and cheaper materials, simply because they were portable. You could carry them on your back. Later, in the 1920s and early 30s, they had become famous enough, and they had a friend named Lawrence Harris who was very rich, and he built a studio for them. But before that time, the group of 7 painted mainly with the materials that they were able to get a hold of. Now, these men came from an interesting background. Most of them worked in commercial firms. In other words, they designed magazine covers. They designed posters for cinemas. They did all this kind of what we call commercial art. But because they were so influenced by the French, they felt that they should become more serious people. And this is what inspired them to look at Canada and this landscape in particular in a new way. So the group of 7 is a very important part of Canadian culture. It's a 20th century part of our culture because Canada really began to express itself more clearly in the 20th century. Margaret Atwood, who began her writing career in the 1960s, was very aware of the influence and the power of the group of 7. And that is why in her book, Wilderness Tips, she writes a story about a woman who is very engaged with the landscape. Now, in the story that you read, you only read the first 4 pages, and you found out that she was a woman who collected particular pictures. But what you may not know is that later on in the story, when she goes to Camp Manitou, she experiences the wilderness in all its cruelty and its mystery. So Margaret Atwood gives us 2 or 3 different interpretations of the landscape in her short story. Now, my colleague Piero has spent quite some time putting together a little show for you. And this is, the first part of the show is specifically on the group of 7. Now, before we start it, I want to point out one thing to you. In the story, in the second paragraph, you don't have to look at it, I'll read it for you. We find out that Lois has a collection of the group of 7. And they give us the names of these artists. She owns 1 Tom Thompson, she owns 3 A.Y. Jacksons, and she owns a number of other artists. And so what Piero has done, once we show you the introduction to the group of 7, he has chosen a number of paintings, the same number of paintings and in the same order as they are described here in the story. So in this first little section, you're going to be looking at art as if this were Lois's personal collection. So this is an illustration of the story directly from the second paragraph. Piero, let's look at the group of 7. Piero has highlighted each one of the painters with their name. Barker Fairley was a critic who supported them. And Franz Johnson was a man who gave them money. Very important when you're an artist. As you can see, they're very formally dressed. Now, here's the first. This is the same sequence that you have in the story. There's Mr. Thompson himself. Piero's put together the portraits of the men and some of their more famous paintings. Lois owns 2. This is the one with the canoe in it because one of the paintings supposedly has a canoe that she owns, so we found this one. Here you can see the painter with his paintbrush. Jackson liked to paint little villages. This was not common in the group of 7. They were mainly interested in open landscape. Notice here that we have a lot of very thick brush strokes. I don't know if you can see it from where you're sitting, but we can see the influence of some of the European painters here. Also, I want you to notice the light. This is the light that's taken from Impressionism, from painters like Auguste Renoir and Claude Manet. And the idea is to give an impression of the landscape, not an exact photographic representation. Keep this in mind when we come to the next few paintings, because the lighting